Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I'm going to talk about the neurological and psychological factors that go into why you are so hooked on playing this game. We're going to talk about the brain, dopamine, and reinforcement of behaviors. So let's get into it. Most people have now heard about dopamine, popularized in the Runescape community by Swampman. But today, imagine this as the blue cape season of your understanding of dopamine, as I try to expand your knowledge on it. As a bit of a disclaimer before we jump in, I will present things in a bit of a simplified way, but just remember that the brain and human behavior is super complex and nothing works in a vacuum, even though it's usually talked about it in that way. So dopamine. Dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter involved in reward signaling, amongst its other many functions. What happens is when you do something that provides you with fulfillment of your organismic needs, such as getting food and eating, a region of your brain called the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, sends dopaminergic signals to regions of the brain involved in perception of reward and in learning. Hence, you feel good and then want to eat again in the future, so you learn to do whatever you just did to get that dopamine to release. Specifically, dopamine is released to the nucleus accumbens, a region dedicated to processing rewards and then subsequently reinforcing the behaviors that led to the release of that dopamine. The idea here being that if you do something that is good for your survival, evolutionarily speaking, it would be good if you continue to do that into the future. The nucleus accumbens will also end up signaling other regions involved in learning and planning of behaviors for this reinforcement to occur. The other main destination for dopamine is in the frontal lobes, where the experience of pleasure, motivation, planning and executing behaviors, and the feelings of urge or craving are processed. Let's also quickly talk about what causes dopamine to be released from the VTA in the first place. As I was just explaining, when something is rewarding, this will lead to dopamine levels rising in the nucleus accumbens and in the frontal lobes. What is rewarding differs amongst people, but generally speaking, things like food, sex, exercise, alcohol or drug use, and even video games can cause this type of dopamine release. While some of these things are not necessarily organismic needs, after our low-level survival needs are met, other high-order cognitive processes do cause things to become rewarding for people based on what they have an interest in. Or in the case of drugs and alcohol, these things can kind of hijack the natural reward system and cause a sort of simulated reward. A good example in Runescape might be when you get that continuous stream of XP drops, a max hit splat, or a rare drop. All of these things and more can cause a sense of reward and then lead to a release of dopamine. Now, this gets even more interesting when we start to think about different types of reinforcement schedules. So from here on out, when I talk about reward, you can think about dopamine releasing in the brain. So a quick crash course in reinforcement. Reinforcement comes from the early days in psychology when behaviorism reigned. B.F. Skinner popularized the idea that all behavior was a consequence of learned patterns and was essentially deterministic in nature based on this process. Many of these early insights come from experiments where Skinner put rats into a Skinner box. In the simplest form, these boxes had a lever that would release food to the rat when pressed. So, as the rat learned to press the lever, it would be given food and then learn to associate the pressing of the lever with getting that food. In a more naturalistic setting, reinforcement is also what everyone commonly does when they are training a new dog. So when the dog does something that they want the dog to be doing, they will give them a treat, that is a reward, to reinforce that behavior. Going forward for our RuneScape examples, you can kind of imagine that the game is our Skinner box, and we are the rats inside of it, and the multitude of activities that can provide a variety of rewards in the game are the lever and the food being released. Now, across time, the research into reinforcement has advanced as researchers began to look into what would happen when reward was administered on different schedules or at different rates relative to the desired behavioral response. They came to discover what are known as reinforcement schedules. There are two main types of reinforcement schedules. The first type is the continuous schedule. In this type, every time a desired behavior occurs, it gets rewarded. So for example, every time that you train a skill in-game, you're rewarded with XP. There might even be an element of this present in other examples, depending on an individual's goals, such as a boss kill count going up with every kill. The second type is the partial schedule, and this is where reward is only presented some of the times to the desired behavior. And this is based on a set of different rules that create 4 subtypes of partial schedules. These subtypes are the fixed ratio, the variable ratio, the fixed interval, and the variable interval. The fixed ratio releases the reward after a fixed number of behavioral responses. A good example of this in Runescape is when you're farming your first Vorkath head or KQ head for the diary. These drops are guaranteed at 50 KC for the Vorkath head and 256 KC for the KQ head, should you not receive one sooner. To contrast this, the variable ratio releases the reward after a variable amount of responses, an amount that is generally unpredictable. So in Runescape, this one is much more straightforward. Any item with no guaranteed drop rate, but some form of 1 in X amount, would be classified as a variable ratio. In our initial example, both of these head drops actually function as both fixed and variable ratios, as they both have fixed and variable drop rates, because you can get the head drop before and after these guaranteed kill counts. The third subtype is the fixed interval. So rather than the number of responses, this focuses on an amount of time that must pass before a reward can be administered again. So examples in Runescape are birdhouse runs or farm runs. These have set time intervals that you must wait before you can receive the reward, in this case perhaps XP, nests, or farming resources. And the final subtype is the variable interval. So similar to the variable ratio, but for time, this sees a variable amount of time between rewards being able to be received. The best example I could come up with here would be perhaps how long it takes for a winter tot round to complete on a mass world. Sometimes there can be quite a bit of variability between each kill count. This isn't a perfect example though, and I'm actually not sure if there is any pure form of variable intervals in Runescape. Can you guys think of other examples from the game that fit any of these types? What category does your favorite activity in game fall under? Comment down below. So, what does all of this really mean, and how does it relate to being hooked on RuneScape? Well, something really interesting happens when you look at experiments where they monitor the response patterns of animals in Skinner boxes with these different reinforcement schedules. In the case of the continuous schedule, a rat would continue to press the lever until it is no longer hungry. Perhaps in RuneScape, this is when you grind a skill, but only until you get bored. Even more interesting is if you were to hook up the rat so that when it pressed the lever, it received electrical impulses directly into its reward centers. This stimulation leads to the experience of a raw orgasmic bliss, and the animal would continue to press this lever at the sacrifice of all other needs until it died. Luckily, we aren't directly hooked up in this way to anything yet. But I'm sure you can start to imagine how this might relate to how addictive behaviors form in general. When we look at the response patterns for partial schedules, we actually see that the variable ratio subtype has the most cumulative responses across the shortest amount of time. The reason here is that the animal will learn that if it does press the lever, it will eventually receive the reward. However, the uncertainty of when they get that reward leads them to press more, quicker, in an attempt to receive the reward as soon as possible. Perhaps in RuneScape, you can imagine that this is someone grinding a new boss non-stop until they complete the major drops. And we just saw a lot of this with the Phantom Muspa and the Wildy boss rework updates. But there is some nuance to this. If the administration of the reward becomes too infrequent in the variable ratio, the animal will begin to slow down its responses, sometimes stopping entirely. Again, In Runescape, this might be what happens when someone burns out before getting the drop that they had been grinding so hard for but just happened to have went dry on. So when we think about what the vast majority of Runescape content is, these are things that likely fall into the continuous schedule or the partial variable ratio schedule. You can see how you may have become a rat in a Skinner box simply pressing a lever. The game is incredibly fun and rewarding to play, and that can lead to cravings or urges, or at the very least, this might be one of the ways that we learn subconsciously to love this game, through the constant sense of reward and achievement that it provides. Before we finish though, I want to make it clear that an urge or craving to play, or even playing a whole lot, does not necessarily constitute a true addiction, just a colloquial use of the term. This model of reinforcement is not the whole picture in human or even animal behavior, so forgive the partial clickbait title. I will say though, that these principles do underlie what occurs in real addictions, just with other facets present, such as disruptions in other critical areas of functioning in someone's life. But maybe we'll leave that for another video for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you're new here. I don't have any sorts of advice or guidance for this topic today, but I just thought it would be an interesting conversation and a chance for you to learn a little bit more about what makes RuneScape so rewarding and fun to play. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. As always, if you have any ideas for future videos or any sorts of questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I read all of them and I'll do my best to respond. Check out my other videos, a couple of them will be on screen right now. And for now, thank you all for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.